Welcome to this History of Two video assignment. This is A World at War, the Home Front. We're coming to you somewhat live from the confines of NCTC, North Central Texas College at Flower Mound. This is an episode on the home front of World War II. Once America was officially in World War II, the country began to mobilize its tremendous industrial capability for war. In 1942, the United States ordered 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, 8 million tons of merchant shipping. Established in 1942, the War Production Board oversaw the conversion of civilian industry to war production. It allocated war raw materials to manufacturers, such as the Jeep, and assigned production priorities and schedules. Led by computer pioneer Dr. Vannevar Bush, the Office of Scientific Research and Development mobilized thousands of scientists on research projects that yielded improvements to radar and sonar, bazookas, proximity fuses, and something called the Manhattan Project. More on that in class. Bond drives by the American public raised $150 million in war bonds. Can you say unbounded determination? The Office of Price Administration set maximum prices on consumer goods and food, administered rationing of consumer goods and food, established wage and price controls, and encouraged conservation. This was accomplished through newspaper drives, scrap metal drives, and victory gardens. Basically, the OPA fought inflation. Wartime spending caused the American economy to grow tremendously. Between 1940 and 1945, the gross domestic product doubled. Such increases made it necessary to establish economic controls and special finance. Between 1939 and 1946, the U.S. government covered 45% of its spending through revenue. 55% was borrowed from the public. By the end of the war, consumer prices rose 31%, as compared to 62% in World War I. World War II ended the Great Depression, not the New Deal. Women at war. Women made strides in the workplace and shared in the increased wealth. Quote, do your part, free a man for service, unquote. Ads like these encouraged women to enter the workforce in non-traditional jobs. Over 6 million women entered the workforce during the war. This represented more than a 50% increase than before the war. In manufacturing, there was a 110% increase than before the war. Women worked as machinists, lumberjacks, blacksmiths, railroad workers, etc. Rosie the Riveter was a poster girl for women in the workforce. She is the beautiful model that you see in coveralls and hard hat. Nearly 200,000 American women volunteered for military service in the Women's Army Corps, the WWII, the Navy's Women's Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, the WAVES, and also their equivalent organizations for the Army Air Force, Marines, and the Coast Guard. African American leaders also encouraged African Americans to fight the WWII campaign, victory over the dictators abroad, and victory from Jim Crow segregation at home. From the start, black leaders insisted on full recognition in the armed forces and defense industries. A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the Railroad Porters Union, suggested marching on Washington, D.C. in protest of racial discrimination in the American industry. He backed off after FDR signed the Fair Employment Act, which banned racial discrimination in hiring in any factory that held defense contracts. It also created the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Eventually, over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces. They served in segregated units. Over 600 African American airmen were trained at a separate flight school in Tuskegee, Alabama. Many of these Tuskegee airmen went on to the 99th Fighter Group of the Army Air Force, one of the best units in World War II. The Red Ball Express was established by the Army Transportation Corps to supply quick-moving Allied forces during the winter of 1944 to 1945 in the race to Berlin. Approximately 75% of the drivers of the Red Ball Express were African American. Native Americans may have supported the war effort more fully than any other group. Over 25,000 Native American men served in the military. Over 19,000 Native Americans worked in defense-related jobs, and thousands of Indian women served as nurses. Most Native Americans joined the war effort for patriotic reasons, although many felt they had no choice. as many of the New Deal programs that had offered them jobs had ended. Unlike African Americans, Indian servicemen were integrated into regular units. All military branches used Indians of various tribes as code talkers. Tribes lending their language to recent military intelligence codes included the Oneidas, the Chippewas, the Comanches, and the Navajo. The last of the Navajo code talkers, Charles Netz, died on Wednesday, June 4, 2015. But of any minority group in the United States, Mexican Americans had the highest percentage of Congressional Medal of Honor winners. Mexican Americans were proud to be Americans and simply discounted the notion that they may be a minority. In fact, this generation of Mexican Americans will classify themselves as white. In 1942, the United States and Mexico entered into a labor agreement designed to help the United States fill its labor shortage. The Vaquero program allowed Mexican workers to immigrate to the United States on the promise that they would not be drafted, plus receive minimum working and living conditions. Most workers, hired on annual contracts, worked in agriculture. Under the Bracero program, about 200,000 Mexican farm workers entered the United States. Mexican Americans gained employment in industry as well. Over 100,000 contracts were signed between 1943 and 1945 to recruit and transport Mexican workers to the United States for employment on the railroads. There was a population shift from rural areas to urban centers. By the end of the decade, there were as many Mexican Americans living in California as there were in Texas. This migration prompted a stream of anti-Mexican editorials and ugly incidents. In Southern California, there was constant conflict between servicemen and Mexican American gang members and teenage zoot suiters, so called for the zoot suit clothes that they wore. In the zoot suit riots of 1943, off-duty sailors and soldiers, joined by hundreds of local white citizens, rampaged through downtown Los Angeles and Chavez Ravine, assaulting Hispanics, African Americans, and Filipinos. And by the way, Chavez Ravine, we all know where that is. It's the site of present-day Dodger Stadium. 830,000 Texans served in the military during World War II, which is 7% of the overall total. 12,000 Texas women served in the military. Texas A&M sent 20,000 students, the most of any university. Texas A&M also trained 14,000 officers, more than West Point. 23,000 Texans died for their country during World War II, and 30 Texans won the Congressional Medal of Honor. The most decorated soldier in the war was Lieutenant Audie Murphy. A poor boy from Hunt County, he volunteered for the Army on his 18th birthday. At the time, he was just 5 foot 7 inches tall, and he weighed 130 pounds. According to historian Randolph B. Campbell of the University of North Texas, Audie Murphy displayed probably the greatest display of courage of any soldier in the entire war. As a second lieutenant, ordered to hold a position with about 30 men and 2 tank destroyers, Audie Murphy faced an attack by 200 German infantrymen supported by 6 tanks. One of his tank destroyers had to be abandoned when it ran into a ditch, and the other took a hit from the German 88mm shell. Ordering his men to take cover in nearby woods, Murphy fired at the advancing Germans with his carbine until he ran out of ammo. Then he jumped on a disabled tank destroyer and began using its .50 caliber machine gun. American artillery closed in on his position to the point that a fire control officer called on the field telephone to ask how close the Germans were. Murphy replied, "Hold the phone. I'll let you talk to one of the bastards." A forward military observer who saw the action later wrote, "With the Germans 100 yards away, he was completely exposed to enemy fire, and there was a blaze under him that threatened to blow the destroyer to bits. Machine gun, machine pistol, and 88 shell fire was all around him. His clothing was riddled by flying fragments of shells and bricks of rock. I saw that his trouser leg was soaked with blood. He swung the machine gun to where 12 Germans were sneaking up a ditch in an attempt to flank his position, and he killed all of them at 50 yards. The most decorated sailor in World War II also came from Texas. Sam Dealey was born in Dallas and trained at the Naval Academy. He commanded a submarine, the USS Harder. and he sank 16 Japanese ships before being destroyed itself in 1944. Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas is named for his uncle, George Dealey, an earlier publisher of the Dallas Morning News and designer of the Triple Underpass. Dory Miller grew up near Waco and joined the Navy in 1939. As an African American in a segregated military, Miller had to serve in the segregated Stewards branch of the Navy. On December 7, 1941, Miller was serving as a mess attendant, second class, on the USS West Virginia, stationed at Pearl Harbor. Miller helped remove the ship's fatally wounded captain from the main deck and then ran to an unintended deck gun and began firing at the enemy planes, in spite of the fact he had not received any gunnery training. For his actions, he received the Navy Cross for his actions. The 36th Division was the National Guard unit federalized during the war that saw heavy combat during the war. Nicknamed the Texas Division, the unit suffered 19,000 men killed or wounded, which was one of the highest casualty rates of any unit in the war. The 90th Division was a motorized National Guard unit that saw action in Europe and suffered nearly as much as the 36th Division. It was nicknamed the Alamo Division. The 90th Division participated in Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day. And Texans were also in senior leadership. Among the seniors, 150 generals were from Texas, 12 admirals were from Texas. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Naval Forces in the Pacific and innovator of the island hopping campaign, grew up in Fredericksburg. General Ira Eaker, who led the 8th Air Force, was born in Field Creek, Texas. Eaker encouraged the development of the personal precision bombing strategy. And on a personal note, Eaker commanded my grandfather in the European campaign. General Claire Chennault organized and commanded the Flying Tigers in China. Chennault was born in Commerce and raised in Baton Rouge, where he got the name the Flying Tigers. Colonel Ovida Holt Hobby was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt to organize and lead the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WACs, later the Women's Army Corps. In Texas, she is better known as the wife of former Governor William Hobby. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He was born in Denison, but more on him in Cold War America. Texas was America's largest training field, as Texas had over 80 military bases. Texas hosted 19 Army bases, 65 airfields, and 4 naval stations. Over 200,000 airmen received their training in Texas. The nation's only female training base, Avenger Field, was located in Sweetwater. Even the British trained in Texas. The Royal Air Force had a flying school in Terrell. Today, you can visit the school. It is a museum. Over 50,000 prisoners of war were housed in Texas compounds, including camps in Princeton, Mexia, Hereford, Hearne, and Huntsville, and on the east shore of White Rock Lake in Dallas. Most inmates were German. Japanese prisoner of wars were interned at camps in Seagoville, Canady, and Crystal City. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Garland all received airplane plants. Houston, Galveston, Port Arthur, Orange, and Corpus Christi received shipyards. The Ford plant in Dallas built 100,000 Army Jeeps and trucks. Ammunition plants were located in Harrison County. This is the Lone Star Army ammunition plant. And in Texarkana. This is the Red River Army Depot. Both of these locations will remain open after the war, providing ammunition to fight the Cold War. War production employed over 1 million people, including 500,000 Texans. The state population grew about 450,000 persons during the war. During World War II, the record on civil liberties was much better than it had been in World War I. German immigrants faced much better because there was little sympathy for Hitler, but Japanese Americans were the victims of discrimination. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a general panic on the West Coast that Japan might invade the West. Many Americans feared that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast might aid such a move. It did not help that Japanese Americans could not apply for U.S. citizenship, those living in the United States. There were also considerable racist attitudes against Asians by whites. Many demanded that they be removed to a safer location. The government was forced to do this by the prevalence of such attitudes. In 1942, FDR signed Executive Order Number 9066, which removed more than 100,000 Japanese Americans from their jobs, homes, and businesses and placed them in relocation camps. These camps were located in remote places like Arizona and Arkansas, but quite often their first new home, because of this internment, was often a converted horse stall at an abandoned racetrack. In an article for the journal New Republic in 1942, Ted Nakashima wrote, "What hurts really most is the constant reference to us evacuees as Japs. We're on this side and we want to help. Why won't America let us?" In 1988, Congress voted to give each internee $20,000 and an official apology. Thank you for watching, and may the force be with you on the next exam.